Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. Raise your hand if you truly believe your parents love you more when you bring home high grades and love you less when you make low ones. This is not my question. This is a question Jessica Leahy, a teacher and author, seems to have asked thousands of students between the ages of 12 and 18 over 5 years. That led to an op-ed in the Washington Post in August 2018 captioned "The big problem with rewarding kids for good grades and punishing them for bad ones. Parents beam when the children bring home good grades, and they pause when the children score low ones." That pause, according to Ms. Leahy, is what gets the children to make the connection between love and reward for good grades and parental disappointment and punishment when the grades are low. Jim Taylor, a psychologist who specializes in sports and parenting and who Ms. Leahy quotes, calls it outcome love, a transaction in which parents bestow the reward of love in exchange for their children's success and withdraw that love as punishment for failures. Singapore has decided to do something about it. Whether a child finishes first or last will no longer be indicated in primary and secondary school report books from next year in Singapore, a move which Education Minister Ong Ye Kung hopes will show students that learning is not a competition. While one can mount arguments in favor of this move, the question remains how best to prepare the child for a world that is fiercely competitive. Shouldn't we follow the biological pattern of natural selection? Should education follow a single pattern and lose many children who might be brilliant in other ways, or focus on how best to bring out the best in every child? Is the latter even possible? Questions abound, and I look forward to an exciting discussion with the panel of experts that include Professor Dora Marinova. She's a professor of sustainability at the Curtin University Sustainability Policy Institute, and she is published in prestigious journals. Joins me from Perth in Australia, Mr. Dean Russell, who has also written a lot about education, but also specializes in digital transformation strategies. Thank you to both the panelists. Let me begin with Professor Marinova. Professor Marinova, on the face of it, looks great. I mean, I wish I could go back to school in Singapore and I wouldn't have to bring grades to my parents. But the fact is that, as I posited the question, life is tough and it's also fiercely competitive. So how is this the best way to prepare the child for what comes next in his or her life?
Well, I don't agree completely that life is always competitive, because there are so many things that we enjoy doing that are not part of competition. Like if you are in nature, if you're just having good time with families, there is no competition there. When it comes to competition, I think you refer more to the job market. And you refer to positions where there are many candidates for a particular job and you want to find the one that is best suited. In my area, the reality is that a lot of these jobs don't even exist when the students are studying at university, and not even when they're at primary or secondary school. So when I was a student, I had to give 45 exams to finish my high education. And at that time, I promised myself that if I'm ever in charge and if I ever have the opportunity, I would never use exams. Because with exams, you are testing particular skills that are not necessarily the skill that you want your child to have in the long run. With exams, it's very difficult to test creativity. It's very difficult to test innovation. It's very difficult to test critical thinking. And these are the type of qualities that are probably more needed in relation to the agenda that we have, how to deal with climate change, how to deal with poverty, how to deal with biodiversity loss, preserving the environment. So with exams, you tend to test more skills that are routine, skills that are established. When you want to look at creativity, when you want to encourage innovation, you need to find other possible options of testing skills. Another example that is very important for me is how we work in groups. And in exams, it's rarely possible to actually test social skills. And social skills are extremely important for us as human beings. So I would say, yes, I would love to go back to school in Singapore and not having to sit exams. So in many ways, I completely support the move that they have taken. As a parent, it's always important to look at the outcomes and at the effort that somebody is putting in being a good learner.
Thank you, Professor. I'll park some of these thoughts and we'll get back to them, but let me go to Ms. Russell on this. Ms. Russell, yes, it's about the job market competition, but there's also something else. And I probably asked this question because I don't know about you, but I went to all boys. And in addition to the extracurricular activities and the curriculum, there was also a different kind of competition among boys, where there were those who were the bullies, and then there were those who got bullied. And that's the kind of thing which begins right at school. And well, the school administration can get into that and try and improve the environment. But the fact is that at the end of the day, it's not about external support for boy X. He has to learn how to deal with the bullies himself if he wants to avoid that kind of treatment for the rest of his life. So what about that kind of competition? We're not just talking about grades, is just one part of it. But this is a much broader issue that we're dealing with here.
I think there's an element of coping there. I mean, I went to a mixed school, and I think it's, bullying is something that's pervasive, sadly, across society. But I think that isn't necessarily competition. Interestingly enough, I think sometimes bullying comes out of many other things. Often it's not necessarily because it doesn't necessarily tie into the educational element, but I think it has to be something that's tackled. I think the social skills, as was mentioned before, are really key. I think we have to separate two things here, though. Is that in reality for schools and for society to know what the levels are across different people so we can make sure that they get the best education that's right for them is really important. And I think, therefore, things like exams and assessments and so on are really important to be able to allow the schools to assess actually how's the school doing, how's the pupils doing, how are they doing compared to their other classes. So I think there's an important element there around, being able to identify markers for improvements, markers for changes. But I also think there's another element, and this was definitely building on what was spoken about before, which is understanding what modern society is about. And the reality is, if you want to know something now, you can Google it pretty quickly, whereas 20, 30 years ago, I remember, my parents forking out a lot of money for the Encyclopedia Britannica, and that was our source of knowledge. The world's changed very much in terms of how we access content, how we analyze it. The rise of artificial intelligence and robotics is going to shift the workplace. And so therefore the ability for young people to be schooled in creative thinking, in terms of critical thinking, in terms of being able to look at the world and assess what they really think about it is going to be really key. And measures around that are really important.
Ms. Russell,
but,
let me interject here. Let me interject. This is prejudice to what you're saying, and obviously you're talking about how things are changing, skill sets and the rest of it. But my question was a little more basic in the sense that, let me reformulate it. Now, if you got William Golding to maroon the boys on an island, Lord of the Flies, and then it's an experiment of sorts where we begin to see how the boys interact and how the hierarchies are created, and that there's an underlying, sort of instinctual, competitive nature of things. And this is at a very basic level. Now, with modernity, we have tried to create systems, rules-based systems and the rest of it, but that particular instinctual streak remains. And as Professor Marinova said, it's very pronounced in the job market. And to me, I think it's very pronounced in lots of other areas of life also. So that is what I'm pointing at. If we look at the children, and if we say we need to take care of everything, we have to protect them in so many ways, then aren't really, we making them soft instead of toughening them up? I mean, that's the basis of my question.
No, I totally understand. Yes, and I think competition's a good thing. I believe in competition. I believe in free markets. I believe in all of those things. And I think with young people in particular, that competitiveness is going to come out with the things that they're really good at and they're not good at. I really believe, the best way for somebody to enjoy their lives is to be the best version of them. And that usually means doing the jobs and the activities that they love doing. Performance follows preference, as I've said in talks around the world. I think the key thing here, though, is that when going to your point about competition and interpersonal skills, there's a line that is drawn, and of course, with Lord of the Flies, I think in terms of those sort of analogies, yes, if you leave it unfettered and you leave competition unfettered, then the risk is that it can become something that's incredibly damaging and incredibly dangerous potentially. But that's where I think as a society comes in and goes, well, actually, we need to look at our kids and actually measure not just how well they're doing in exams, but actually how are they doing socially. And I think bullying is one of those areas that it shouldn't just be down to competition. It should be down to what are the wider social factors, what's happening at home, what are the issues that are affecting them from a mental health perspective, for example. So I don't think necessarily bullying is something that, whilst it can be easily tied to being competitive, especially as children, I think there's an element there around communication and enabling young people to be able to communicate better. And in a world that's connected to the whole world every day, via Twitter, via social media, via Skype and emails and everything, then actually communication skills are going to be absolutely key. And I think with bullying and things like that, they can often come out of a lack of communication, a lack of being able to explain one's position, and a lack of being able to debate. And I think with really young kids, they need to, they obviously need to be taught how to communicate, how to not bully, but also be seen that when they are successful at something, that of course they should be rewarded, but that doesn't mean that they're not going to be good at something else. And I think that's the bit that for me is so important.
Okay. Professor Marinova, you talked about the job market. You also said that there's so many other areas of life where there's no competition, where you do things simply because you feel good about them. So two things. One, as I said in my opening, should education follow a single pattern, or one needs to focus and find out about children, lots of them, what exactly are they really good at? And B, that instead of looking at the child's capacity or capabilities in a single examination, to actually determine her capacity over the entire academic year, or maybe not just one academic year, but several academic years. Is that the process you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. With an exam, you're actually measuring performance at one short period of time, while performance over extended period of time is measured differently. And what I think is very important is for children to be challenged intellectually, to be challenged socially, in the sense to encourage communication, as Dean was saying. So it's not this short moment performance when somebody may be feeling unwell, or maybe they be thinking about something else. It's more what they're capable of achieving over a period of time. So I definitely agree that there are different ways of assessing people, and therefore, for example, in university we have 3-4 assessments during the semester, rather than only one exam. And the type of assessments that are being used need to vary. Exam is has been used for so long that we kind of accepted that this is normal. But it's probably time to reconsider and see what exactly we're trying to get out of the assessment process. And ultimately, we want to
Professor Marinova,
skill develop.
Professor Marinova, so there's the academic things at school, and then there's the sports. Now, we can say that we don't want to grade the children as far as their academic performance is concerned. because we don't want them to consider learning as a competition. But how do we go about that in sports performance?
I don't have a problem with competition at sports. That's different to academic performance or different to learning. Sports always are often competition even with yourself. You're trying to run faster, you're trying to jump higher, and this is more challenging yourself rather than a competition. So I think there is a role for sports to play in that, and there is a role of skills development. And what education is about is more skills development. And the challenge that goes with.
But hold on. Let me try and understand this. You see, you're absolutely right. I would like to run faster. I'm not just going to compete with others during a competition, but when I'm practicing, I'm competing against myself also. But the same competitive spirit can also express itself in academic performance. Now, if we take averages, we might come across children who are not particularly interested in that kind of competition, but then there will be these high performers who are. So how do we, are we going to create a mean here? What exactly do we do with this?
No. I'm not saying that we should be looking at mean performance. What I'm saying is that we should encourage everybody to perform to the maximum of their abilities. And by creating a diversity of tasks. Some people are much better at practical side of things, others are much better theoretical side of things. Social skills are something that are necessary from anybody. So you need to have different types of assessments that are able to capture the range of skills that are required in modern society, rather than just an exam which essentially measures the quickness of your reaction and the competitives and how you're positioned against other people. So it's more looking at what skills a person have and how they communicate, how they relate, how they react to new opportunities that we need to be able to measure. So it's not how you're positioned against other people.
Okay, thank you. That was Professor Marinova speaking with us. I'm going to take a short break and return to this discussion with another panelist also. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. We continue with our discussion of education, competition, examinations, and the PEG is the decision by the Singapore Education Ministry that there will be no grades for primary and secondary school children. I'm also joined now by Professor Hamid Tizhoosh, who teaches at the Waterloo University and, in fact, had a TED Talk which was captioned "Competition Destroys Education." And Mr. Dean Russell also is with us. Let me just begin with Professor Tizhoosh. Professor Tizhoosh, we were talking about if we are saying that let the children be and let's not have any particular examinations or not have grades, then how do we determine performance? And what do we do about the competitive streak that we do find among humans?
That's very difficult to do just at schools. Examination is just one part of a competitive or competition-oriented education. So we, as you said, we need some ways of verifying that students have acquired the knowledge. So perhaps without tests and examination, that may be not possible. However, the problem is that we have turned exams and tests into the main vehicle of education. So, and this is not just about the exam. The problem is that the competitive mindset that from the parent house we put in the head of our kids to the school and to the colleges and universities is not just the exam.
Professor, would you say that this has a lot to do with the job market?
Most likely so, because our schools and colleges and universities are basically trade schools. We teach skills, And we teach them in many places, we teach them very well, and we prepare our students well for the job market. And that's why we try to also nurture that competitive mindset, because the job market is competitive.
Absolutely. Now, so let me quickly take this to Dean Russell here. Dean, so you run an organization, a consultancy. When you are hiring, do you look at the GPAs? What exactly are you looking for in candidates?
So what I primarily look for, actually, I assume there's a level of skill set, and that often will be told based on not just on what they've done in education, but that's one measure, but also what they've done outside of education. What are their interests? What have they done? But ultimately, I'll often hire based on enthusiasm and actual personal skills related to the job. So if you're looking at a salesperson, you don't want someone who's going to give up first time. If you're looking after somebody or hiring an accountant, you don't want to hire someone who's not got an attention to detail. And they will often be personality traits as much as what they might have got in university. And I think within that, in my book, How to Win, which very much ties into the competitive side of things, I talk about winning pitches and winning new business and winning sales is often a process. It's not just about one moment. And I think that's the same for education. When I talk about how to win from a business perspective, it's the same in education. The challenge, I think, going back to the previous speaker's point, is that if the ultimate goal in education is to train people to pass exams, that's not going to help them in life. If the ultimate goal is to measure their ability to do a certain task and the exam is part of that measure, then I think, therefore, it has a lot more value. And I think that's the bit for young people and for schools and for education.
Would you say that, okay, let me talk about the United States, because that's where you are. So would you say that the schooling system and the examination system is best geared towards what you're saying, or whether it's not?
I think, I'm a parent, and I see all sides. I see the pressures that parents have on their kids to pass exams and the pressures kids put on themselves to pass exams. I think there has been a shift over the past few years to really focus on the exam itself and teaching kids how to pass exams. But the reality is, I've always said, you cannot judge a fish based on how well it can climb a tree. And some kids are going to be brilliant at vocational tools, some skills. Some kids are going to be great at academia. Some are going to be a mix of both. Some are perhaps even neither. And there's something else.
So then we require, based on what you're saying, and I completely agree with you, and this is something that I refer to also in my opening, that at the during schooling years, the system needs to identify what child can do what, and bring out the best in her. And I'm not sure if, at least I'm talking about Pakistan, where I'm based, that our system doesn't really cater to that.
I think that's where technology is going to help. Weirdly enough, I think with things like artificial intelligence, the ability to measure things beyond what's just put on a binary scale of yes or no, or on a scale of, did they get 0 to 100% in scores? I think we'll be able to, in the future, be able to measure much more softer skills and the impact of that. What I would say on that, if I may, I think the other really important point there is that we have to make sure all of our education systems don't just focus on the passing of the exam, but on that wider skilling.
Absolutely. There I completely agree with you. Thank you. That was Dean Russell speaking. Let me just go back to Professor Tizhoosh here. Professor, give us the crux of your TED talk that I refer to, Competition Destroys Education. Give me the gist of that.
Well, learning is inherently a self-discovery process. We have to help our kids from the beginning, and that starts from parents' house. It's not just schools. It's not just colleges and universities. Learning is inherently a self-discovery process. It's inherently individualistic. We can learn from each other, of course, but if that should not be disturbed by the competition and the competitive landscape. So competition basically brings in and you compare yourself all the time with others. So you may in fact be able to objectively look at the level of skills that you have and say, I need this skills and that skills, and I don't have it, and my classmate has it. And you may approach to learn that skill from the teacher, from the classmates. But the problem is that the competition basically removes the learning part, and it becomes a psychological entity that you compare yourself all the time with others, as we do in the normal life, because it's not just about the school. And whenever there is comparison, there is competition. So a learning system that can completely nurture and support the learning, the education system that can completely support the learning, has to remove the comparison, because you have to focus and give attention to your own ability. And that's very challenging. So we are struggling to look at that. An exam could be a vehicle, but just removing them may not be helpful.
Okay. Now, personally speaking, I'm a slow reader. So when I'm reading, although I'm a voracious reader, but when I'm reading, I read slow. I focus on various ideas. I kind of, this is a process of like, swirling a good drink in one's mouth, thinking about them, trying to create a web of ideas through that. But when I was at college, we would be given like 3 texts or 5 essays and asked to read them overnight, because the next day they would be discussed in the class. And I always thought that that wasn't really a great thing to do. I don't know, I mean, since you teach, how do you look at that?
Well, we have forgotten that this is a problem that is everywhere. It's not just this country or that country. So the main vehicle that we have for learning is observation and inquiry. So we have to look at ourselves, we have to look at the world around us, and we have to ask questions. And this is what we are not teaching. So we set some goals, and God knows where we get those goals. That depends different part of the world and different cultures. And we try to push our students toward those goals, which is mainly skills. So we want to teach them skills. But we do not teach from the beginning, from when they are little kids. We don't teach them to observe and ask questions. Asking questions, here and there you hear that we want to have people with critical mind. But where we do that, when we teach our students to ask questions and to observe themselves. Observation is the main venue to learning. So if we don't teach, as you said, you were observing yourself how you read. So that's fundamental for learning.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was Professor Hamid Tizhoosh speaking with us. As Wordsworth said, I mean to speak of that interminable building reared by observation of affinities in objects where no brotherhood exists to common minds. So it's essentially about the ability to make connections, and the only way to do that is if one absorbs what one learns. We'll take a short break and return to discuss the Lebanon protests. Is it Arab Spring 2.0? Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. As I said before we went on a break, are the protests in Lebanon and also in Iraq, Arab Spring 2.0. The protests in Lebanon, which began last week, continue. In the latest development, protesters have rejected President Michel Aoun's call for dialogue, demanding the government resign before any such talks can take place. In a televised address to the nation on Thursday, Aoun had said that he was willing to meet demonstrators who have been taking to the streets for 8 straight days, calling for Lebanon's post-Civil War leadership to be held accountable for years of corruption and economic mismanagement. Interestingly, similar protests have also, as I said, rocked Iraq. However, unlike Iraq, where the government moved swiftly with force against the protesters, the Lebanon protests have remained peaceful and the atmosphere has even been festive. The government, too, has refrained from using force despite deploying law enforcement personnel. What exactly is going on and how the situation might unfold is what we shall discuss tonight. And we are joined by Habib Battah. He's a reporter and investigative journalist, editor of the news site BeirutReport.com. He has also covered Lebanon and the Middle East over the last 15 years. So we're also joined by Dr. George Szamuely, who's a senior research fellow of Global Policy Institute, joins us from Budapest. Mr. Battah, what exactly is happening? I mean, on the one hand, we see from a distance that the atmosphere is festive. In fact, we saw some security forces personnel, at least there was one video in which the soldier had started crying, and we saw the protesters actually sort of, placating him. On the other hand, there's also the issue of a maximalist position by the protesters. So what exactly are we looking at, and where exactly might the situation go?
Well, there have been some clashes with police and army. They haven't been very heavy clashes. There were some arrested and released subsequently, not so long after. It's just a lot of pushing and shoving at this point. Some batons did come out, and some people were hit with batons, but definitely not the kind of reaction you see in other Arab countries where, protesters are just basically shot at. Or even other parts of the world, not just the Arab world. So there has been a bit of a very kind of cautious approach, I think, from the security services. They're just kind of standing back. I think they're just trying to wait for people to get tired because they've been out in the streets, sleeping in the streets, people for a week now. People aren't even sleeping in Lebanon, it seems. There's millions of people in the streets. You really can't move anywhere. There's no schools open, no shops open. The country is on basically complete shutdown, and it's the people in the street that are responsible for that. So there has been some tensions, and now actually there have been some tensions with not the police or the security or the army, but actually the paramilitary militias that belong to the political leaders in Lebanon. Let's not forget, these are actually former warlords who have militias and armed men. So they're actually going down to the streets now, and they're starting to cause some trouble and some fistfights with protesters.
Okay, that's a very interesting point, but stay with me. Let me pull in Dr. Szamuely here. Dr. Szamuely, how do you look at the situation? There was one foreign policy article that said the Arab world's revolution against sectarianism. And the article actually said that there's a streak that sort of combines what's happening in Iraq with what's happening in Lebanon, although there are differences also. Is that what you think is actually happening there?
I see it much more a rebellion against certain economic policies. And it's very hard to see how the Lebanese government can get itself out of the mess it's in by continuing to pursue the economic policies it's pursuing. Namely, it's using up foreign currency reserves in order to prop up the Lebanese pound. That is a recipe for economic disaster. I mean, there are people here in Lebanon who are aggrieved about their living conditions, aggrieved about the appalling nature of the infrastructure, aggrieved about lack of clean water. And what's the government's economic program? It's to continue this neoliberal policies, which is simply using its foreign reserves to prop up the currency at an unrealistic rate.
Dr. Szamuely, let me interject here. The Taif agreement actually created a certain kind of governance framework. And as Habib said, within this governance framework, today's political leaders were yesterday's warlords. Now, this is a template where what the protesters are saying essentially is that these guys don't need to break this template because they are the beneficiaries of this. And far from, under the garb of neoliberalism, I think what they're saying is that these guys have been making riches while everyone else is getting poorer. So isn't that a factor more than in terms of the direction of causality? That the economic woes flow from the kind of political framework that there is, the power configuration?
Yes, that's absolutely right. There's no question that there's every reason for the people of Lebanon to be extremely annoyed about the way the wealth is distributed and about the warlords and all the powerful elites that have their hand in the pie and no one else gets a share of the pie. I mean, that's undoubtedly the case.
Okay, let me take this back to Habib Battah. Habib, what do you think of the direction of causality? I mean, in terms of the governance template, if the template is not working, I mean, if it's not working for the people at large, of course, it's definitely working for those who are in power. then that's what the protesters are essentially asking for. And economic woes then become, in a way, that's an issue that flows from the political configuration.
It's very, very difficult to separate the two. We always have this demand in Lebanon that we need to privatize things, and the private sector can fix things and make things well. Well, the private sector is the public sector. It's the same people, it's the same businessmen. The businessmen are the politicians. So these things are just, we really can't separate them. But what's been interesting is the determination of people in these last few days. And I mean, there's also a fight for dignity. I mean, when the people who have all the money, let's not forget that it's less than 1% of Lebanon controls half the wealth. I think it's 0.3%. It's less than 1%. And so the wealth gap is so huge. You see people driving around in their Ferraris, had the fanciest nightclubs in the world. I've been around the world. I've never seen anything like the amount of money being spent on the streets of Lebanon, where people are actually making $2 a day as well. People are living in neighborhoods that are infested with garbage. People are living in neighborhoods that are sewage infested. People are living with toxic air. The generators, there's no electricity in the country, so there are all these diesel generators spewing exhaust constantly. So people are being squeezed economically. They're being squeezed in terms of the physical environment they live in. Their health is at stake. And also just being robbed of their dignity. These people who go around town with these bodyguards and just pushing cars out of the way with their convoys and their tinted windows. I mean, and the way the police actually sometimes talk to protesters, they curse at them. So there's no real decorum. It's a very kind of a thuggish mentality of those in power. It's a gangster rule, actually. So I think all these things really just come together. And that's what brought people to the streets, is that they don't even have the right to talk on the phone with WhatsApp without paying, more of a militia fee, let's say, not a tax, but to these gangsters who run the country.
Absolutely. That's very interesting. But since you talked about the economic side of it, as did Dr. Szamuely, I'm also joined by Dr. Kamel Wazne, a university assistant professor, teaches international relations, economic and financial policies at the City University of New York. Dr. Wazne, how do you look at the situation in Lebanon, and what is the direction? We were trying to determine the direction of causality, and my point was that, of course, there are the economic woes, but they kind of flow from the political configuration that was put together through the Taif Agreement, and that's a template that works for those in power. And they don't have any reason to break that template, but it doesn't work for the protesters. So one of the things that needs to be done is, and what I assume they're demanding, is the breaking of that template and a different kind of constitutional compact.
It's a huge demand in Lebanon for change in policy, change in economic direction, and there is a change in political system. As I'm speaking to you, I'm watching a big fight going on inside Beirut. So I'm like, it's getting really nasty what is taking place right now on the street. A lot of people are angry. A lot of people are frustrated because, in one hand, they want to see their voice carried out and carry a mandate for a change for the best for the country, bring reform, and bring what the people been hoping for a very long time, a very prosperous country. But the level of corruption, the level of misguided policy on the term of monetary policy, on the term of fiscal policy, has taken its impact on the Lebanese economy. That's why you see people are desperate for a change, and this change is not going to be actually happen anytime soon because of the
and you don't think that the package that was announced by the premier, which the protesters have rejected, was enough to sort of herald that change, or at least be a step towards that change?
I don't think Lebanon is a very, very delicate place where the voice of the people and the sectarian politics are in conflict with each other, and it doesn't matter how righteous you are in your demand, but when it comes to the sectarian, I think the sectarian prevail in Lebanon, and I think that's what is taking place is very dangerous on where will take the country. I hope this will not.
Okay, I get your point. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Wazne speaking with us. Thank you also to Dr. George Szamuely. And before I wrap up, let me just quickly go back to Habib Battah here. And there's also an Associated Press report that has just come before me, which says that the Iraqi police fired live shots into the air, as well as rubber bullets and dozens of tear gas canisters on Friday to disperse thousands of protesters on the streets of Baghdad, sending young demonstrators running for cover. So, Habib, what do you think if so there is a certain kind of maximalism from the protester side also, and I'm assuming that the government is also not going to just simply buckle down. So the festive atmosphere that I was talking about and the relatively peaceful atmosphere, do you think that is likely to not last for very long?
Well, we're starting to see some tensions today, and we've been seeing them for the last few days as, again, some of these, parties will send men, often older men, even wearing military clothes sometimes, to the protests to start chanting counter slogans. And so that seems to be the strategy now, is to try to infiltrate the protest by, inserting a bunch of men to cause fights, and they're very aggressive. They have fist fights already with some people in the crowd. So, not to say that people don't actually, have these views. I think that we have to also realize that in Lebanon and all of the Middle East and any country with a very strong regime that's held power for a long time, they've made a lot of friends along the way, and they've fed a lot of families along the way. And those people who have relied on these regimes are not a few. They're in the millions or the thousands sometimes, depending on the country. And you have to realize that they will view this as an attack on their livelihoods. So there has to be some kind of way to integrate people, to be inclusive, without completely saying that you want to erase the past and forget it happened. But let's also not forget that a lot of these leaders have maintained their power because they have ties to Western governments, Russian government, Iranian government. So it's not just something that's just happening in Lebanon right now. This is, Lebanon, the way it's run is through an international coalition of countries that try to settle scores in Lebanon, that fund money to the different parties in Lebanon. So without, the U.S., Syria, France, Iran, these leaders would not be in power. So we also have to ask
Absolutely. I hear you loud and clear. Habib Battah was speaking with us. Thank you for your insights. This is all for this week from Indus Special. We shall see you next week at the same time. Meanwhile, for latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.